a writer of the dead with secrets of the living. Welcome to Midnight Radio Drama. I am your host, Wilfred. Drop a comment with your location. I love picturing where you all are. Now the mystery begins. In the small and moderately respectable offices of the Flaxborough Citizen, Miss Eileen Cleeve had long been permitted a modest dominion. Her desk, situated not in the newsroom proper but in a side room optimistically titled Features and Special Notices, was hemmed in by filing trays, mauve carbon paper, and the last known functioning bottle of quink ink in the county. She had occupied that desk for 17 years, or 22 if one counted her 5-year stint writing the church notices under the pen name E.C., an anonymity she once defended with the words, "One never knows what zealots may do." Her colleagues, such as they were, considered her entirely useful. She typed briskly, spoke seldom, and could be relied upon to correct participles without consultation. She never brought in strong-smelling lunches or made political remarks. The only real disturbance she had ever caused was dying, which she did, without permission, on a Tuesday afternoon shortly after tea, midway through an obituary for a Mr. Percival Hooper, formerly of Station Road, later of the Flaxborough Chess League, and, for reasons unexplained, once of Buenos Aires. The cause of death, later recorded as sudden cardiac arrest, natural, elicited no forensic interest. Her body was discovered not dramatically slumped, but faintly inclined, as though contemplating the question of whether Mr. Hooper had indeed been well loved or merely respected. A half-sucked barley sweet was found beside her hand. The remaining ones, intact in their tin, were later discreetly removed by the cleaning lady. Mr. Pym, the paper's editor, received the news with an expression of controlled dismay. "Well," he said, glancing at the death notice proofs stacked haphazardly in Miss Cleeve's out tray, "that's inconvenient." He was a man of strict priorities, and few of them were sentimental. "Did she finish Mr. Hooper's?" he asked Mrs. Gloss, the receptionist, who had summoned him with the tones usually reserved for flooded lavatories and vicarage deaths. "No," said Mrs. Gloss, looking paler than usual. "It just says survived by his two, and then it trails off." "Wife?" Mr. Pym offered without much conviction. "I wouldn't presume," she replied, in the tone of one who had long suspected Mr. Hooper of duplicity in domestic matters. By the time Dr. Ravel, the local GP, had certified the death and offered his routine condolences to no one in particular, the office had resumed something approaching order. Miss Cleeve's body was taken away in a hearse lent by Glass and Trimble, who had thoughtfully included a single white lily and a bottle of Dettol in the back seat. It was not until early the following morning, however, that the death became a matter for police attention. This occurred not due to any visible foul play, but because Sergeant Love, sent by Inspector Purbright to collect Miss Cleeve's personal effects, on the grounds that the coroner would likely inquire, found something that rather disrupted the gentle narrative of a life untroubled by novelty. Among the assortment of handkerchiefs, notepads, combs, and a surprisingly heavy dictionary of quotations was a sealed envelope. It bore no stamp, but was addressed in Miss Cleeve's clear and characteristically tight script to R.W., care of Swanley House, as arranged. The tone of the address was notable. Miss Cleeve seldom employed italics, and certainly never for effect. That she had underlined as arranged suggested a formality that might, just might, be freighted with unease. Sergeant Love, not given to imagination but unusually precise in his handling of stationery, noted the envelope's weight, slight, and thickness, modest, and reported the matter to Purbright with a mixture of curiosity and reticence. Inspector Purbright, who had spent the morning in a drafty municipal subcommittee room, discussing street lamp maintenance schedules with the borough surveyor, was not immediately inclined toward intrigue. He received the news of the letter while massaging his temples and gazing out of a window whose view offered only the back of an Anglican church and the front of an electrical supplier who had once been arrested for importing erotic calendars under the guise of foreign language instruction. "Swanley House," Purbright repeated mildly. "Yes, sir." "Not, I suppose, a known boarding establishment or home for distressed gentlefolk?" "No, sir." "Then let us consult the directory." They did so, or rather Love did, in the back pages of a red leather volume which had, over time, acquired the smell of cellars and forgotten projects. Swanley House was not listed, nor did it appear in the Borough Assessor's Register, the last 3 years of the Citizens' Event listings, or the Church of England Gazetteer. It was only when Love, inspired more by tedium than insight, searched the now-defunct licensing records held at the police station archives that he found it. Swanley House, trading name of L.A. Remedies, licensed massage and aromatic services, ceased trading October 1994. The address, a flat above a chip shop once rated for its curious habit of locking the front door during hours of advertised service. "Massage parlor," Purbright said after a long pause. "Unlicensed." "Briefly licensed, sir. Lost its certificate after a minor disturbance." "Ah." The address was now occupied by a discount carpet emporium. The proprietor, a Mr. Roffley, claimed no knowledge of any Swanley House and expressed a great distaste for what he called carry-on of that sort, though he admitted the back room still carried a bit of a pong. The envelope, opened under proper authority, contained a short note in the same neat script. R. All is arranged, as before. Wednesday, 6. No names, please. E. It was, in its sparseness, rather more troubling than anything explicit. That R was a man seemed probable. That the meeting was recent or still pending remained unclear. The phrasing "as before" implied repetition, and repetition implied routine. Purbright returned to the Citizen and quietly requested access to Miss Cleeve's desk. Mr. Pym, not without suspicion, waved a limp hand in its general direction. The inspector rifled through drawers with the discretion of one accustomed to fingering through social debris. Among the detritus, ribbons, blotters, a faded postcard of Harrogate, he found a second notebook, black-covered and fastidiously indexed. It was not the sort of thing Miss Cleeve would have left visible. The notebook contained names, many names. Some were underlined in blue, some annotated in red pencil. A number were marked with asterisks, and alongside each, whether printed or cryptic, were dates. Some were deaths, but not all. One entry, written in green ink, read simply, R.W., Swanley House. Discretion. Repeat. No copies. Purbright closed the book. Behind him the faint hum of the Citizen's linotype machine thudded in rhythmic certainty. Outside, it had begun to rain in a thin, municipal way. He looked once more at the letter, now resealed in an evidence sleeve. The contents had not been scandalous, not directly, and yet there was a note of rehearsed caution in every line, as though Miss Cleeve had, for some time, composed more than death notices. "She was a curious one," muttered Mr. Pym, passing by with a sheaf of funeral announcements. "Did her work, though, no nonsense." Purbright nodded politely, but he said nothing. And as the last line of her final obituary trailed into a half-formed thought, a quiet unease settled. Not over what she wrote, but over what she chose not to. It is not generally the business of newspaper receptionists to decipher grief. Mrs. Gloss, however, had long held that the Citizen's front desk was, in effect, a confessional without a curtain. She was, by turns, diplomatic, deft, and sharply efficient, and had for years handled sympathy cards, births, and letters to the editor with the same air of reluctant stewardship. She believed that human emotion, if left to itself, would misfile everything. So it was with some interest, though no outward expression of it, that she received a small envelope bearing only a neatly hand-lettered "to the editors," and on the reverse the faintest impression of a personal seal. The card within, cream-stock and lightly scented, contained no signature but quoted, in slanted blue ink, a line from Catullus, "Atque in perpetuum frater of atque vale." Mrs. Gloss, who thought Catullus was a racehorse, brought it to Mr. Pym, who thought it a mistake. "Foreign?" he asked, frowning at the looped script as though it might correct itself. "Could be one of those Cod Classics types. We get them sometimes when retired Latin masters pass on. Someone wrote a haiku when Mrs. Mallard died." He placed the card aside, next to a boilerplate notice about the Lions Club raffle, and turned back to his galley proofs. It was Sergeant Love, who had dropped by to confirm the status of Miss Cleeve's employment records, who took an interest in the card. He held it as one might a clue reluctantly retrieved from a public swimming bath. "Latin, sir," he said later to Inspector Purbright. "Something about farewell forever." Purbright replied without enthusiasm. "Poetry and condolence is often a substitute for direct involvement. It wasn't signed, then it wasn't heartfelt. Still, it was enough to warrant inspection. The postmark, when finally discerned beneath the filigree of the cancellation ink, traced to a small sorting office near the Flaxborough Railway Depot, a location of minor but consistent interest to the borough's moral statisticians. The depot housed, among other things, a lorry dispatch company, 2 off-brand tobacconists, and a collection of flats noted for their refusal to install intercoms. Purbright, who mistrusted coincidence but had learned not to overvalue it either, asked Love to make gentle but observant inquiries near the sorting office. Love, who excelled at appearing aimless while cataloging minutiae, accepted this as a morning's work. He returned 2 hours later with notes on a porter, a tobacconist's assistant, and an unnervingly friendly hairdresser who claimed to know every postcode in Flaxborough by scent alone. The flats yielded little. They were gray, underheated, and rich in the aroma of pre-packaged lentils. One tenant, a man of uncertain age but decisive opinions, claimed to have known a lady of letters who lived nearby and wore hats indoors. Upon being shown a photograph of Miss Cleeve, he hesitated, not in recognition but in calculation. "She might have come by now and again," he said. "Delivered things, quiet type." "What sort of things?" asked Love. "Envelopes, cards, the sort you open after supper." "Birthday cards?" "No," the man said, after a thoughtful pause. "No one round here has birthdays." Meanwhile, at the Citizen, Mrs. Gloss made her own discovery. She had been instructed, half-heartedly, to sort through Miss Cleeve's drawer of unused sympathy cards. Standard issue, white border, no sentiment stronger than "with regret," in case one could be adapted to announce her own passing. There, nestled between cards bearing scenes of doves and unidentifiable woodland, was a small box labeled "Private Hold." It contained 6 pre-written condolence cards, unsigned but addressed to surnames now familiar from the obituary ledger. Each card bore a different quotation: Dryden, Blake, Seneca, and each was worded in that same formal hand, elegant but effortful, as though the writer had taught himself penmanship in order to forget he had once written differently. There was no return address, but the cards shared one curious trait. Each had been postmarked from a different district, all within Flaxborough, but none close to the newspaper's offices. Sergeant Love noted this with a certain dry satisfaction. He liked to keep moving, he said, whoever he was. The address R.W., care of Swanley House, remained the only direct lead, and it had long since vanished beneath new signage and laminate flooring. When Purbright visited the current tenant, a Mr. Roffley, who sold carpets of varying opacity, he was received with courteous suspicion and a faint air of trade depression. "Massage parlor, was it?" Roffley said. "Not in my time, of course. I run a respectable concern. Nylon blend, mostly. Look, touch, doesn't stain." "I'm not here about the carpet," Purbright said diplomatically. "No one is," replied Rafley with an air of injured pride. Swanley House had indeed existed, briefly licensed per the archives for therapeutic services. It had surrendered its license quietly after the borough inspector found a discrepancy between its stated square footage and the number of treatment rooms. No arrests had been made. The proprietor, one Linda Allam, nay, perhaps something else, had decamped shortly thereafter to Bournemouth, where she reportedly ran a salt therapy clinic of suspicious profitability. "Still," said Roffley, leaning confidentially against a display roll, "a few blokes still ask about it. Old times and all that. Had a certain reputation, quiet place, clean towels, no funny music." "And clients?" asked Purbright. "Wouldn't know, would I? But you could tell they were the sort who didn't want receipts." It was a small comment, easily made, but it rang with quiet implication. Back at the station, Purbright reviewed the obituary Miss Cleeve had been composing at the time of her death. Mr. Percival Hooper had, by all available records, lived a singularly uneventful life, interrupted only by bowel complaints and chess tournaments. Yet Miss Cleeve had begun her final paragraph, unfinished, by noting he was survived by his 2 children, wives, mistresses, plants. The line ended, uncourteously, with a blotted comma. Purbright turned to the red-penciled ledger. Mr. Hooper's name was indeed there. Beneath it, in careful brackets, were 3 letters, R.W.H. He looked again at the unsigned card. Ave Ake Vale. It was not grief, not exactly, nor guilt. It was something else, cleaner but colder. A farewell, yes, but also a dismissal. In the file marked miscellaneous correspondence, Purbright placed the card, the envelope, and a typed memo. Origin unclear. Style educated. Motive pending. He closed the drawer but left the key in the lock. The Flaxborough Widows' Afternoon Fellowship met on alternate Thursdays in the side room of the Methodist Hall, a space more often employed for jumble sales and disputed scripture study. Its chairs were unforgiving, its heating intermittent, and its biscuits chosen with an eye to perishability. Nevertheless, its members came faithfully. They came for companionship, for the reassurance of shared survival, and, though they would not have admitted it, for the moral indulgence of gentle gossip, disguised as civic concern. Inspector Purbright, invited under the auspices of community outreach, accepted with the serenity of a man who knew when resistance was futile. Sergeant Love came along out of obligation and brought with him a clipboard, which he used to look official and avoid eye contact. They arrived midway through a reading entitled "The Importance of Proper Closure," delivered by a Mrs. Bream in the tone of someone reluctantly explaining cremation to a child. The applause, when it came, was polite, but distant. Mrs. Snapstone, the group's chairwoman and spiritual engine, welcomed the inspectors with a nod too vigorous to be genuine. "We're very grateful," she said, "when the authorities make time for ordinary people." "I rather think," murmured Purbright, "that ordinary people make up the bulk of the criminal classes." Mrs. Snapstone smiled blankly and gestured toward the teacups. The tea was warm in temperature and weak in resolve. The biscuits, round and dusty, tasted faintly of chalk and moral purpose. Sergeant Love pretended to take notes, while Purbright, armed with his gentle voice and expression of permanent courtesy, addressed the gathered ladies on the responsible disposal of private papers. It was, ostensibly, a talk on safeguarding against fraud, but the real subject was Eileen Cleeve. "Miss Cleeve," Purbright said, folding his hands with ecclesiastical precision, "was known to many of you." A few nods, one sniff. "She served this town with quiet diligence," he continued, "but it seems she also had, how shall I put it, a broader interest in the legacy of others." There was a delicate pause, long enough for a sugar cube to dissolve. Mrs. Dennop, a thin woman who wore a lilac turban and claimed to have once corresponded with Agatha Christie, lifted her teacup with notable slowness. "She corrected my Arthur's obituary," she said. "Took out the mention of his motorbike, said it didn't suit the tone." Another woman, known only as Elsie M., gave a sharp nod. "She offered to reword George's, said the phrasing was, well, she didn't like the phrase, found dead at sea, said it had undertones." "I imagine it did," murmured Purbright. The tone of the meeting began to shift. Confessions, though small and offered with disclaimers, began to cluster like mushrooms. Miss Cleeve had, it seemed, served not only as a recorder of deaths, but as a cautious editor of the Truth. She removed references to children born inconveniently early, occupations best forgotten, and cause of death notations too colorful for a modest column. "She helped us," Mrs. Snapstone admitted, though with an air of posthumous charity. She understood that reputation lasts longer than breath. "Was there money involved?" Purbright asked gently. "No," said the ladies in quiet chorus. Then, after a pause, "not as such." Miss Cleeve, it emerged, had accepted what were referred to as gestures, donations to the Temperance Guild, a new hymnal for St. Timothy's, occasional supplies of tinned fish. One widow had sent her flowers each year on the anniversary of her husband's unmentionable demise, which Miss Cleeve had rewritten as a peaceful homegoing. "Did she ever suggest altering obituaries in advance?" Purbright asked. There was a longer silence. "Well," said Mrs. Dennop, "she did mention, once, that it was best to be prepared." "Prepared," she said. "You wouldn't want the Gazette to do it in their style, would you?" "And of course I didn't." Purbright sipped his tea. "And so?" "I gave her a few facts. She typed something up. Said she'd keep it safe. This was not, on the face of it, illegal. It wasn't even terribly unusual, but it was a hint, an edge. Miss Cleeve had amassed more than memories. She'd collected reputations still in progress, and that made her, in Flaxborough terms, rather powerful. At the end of the talk, Mrs. Snapstone presented Inspector Purbright with a bottle of elderflower cordial and a pressed leaflet entitled, "What the Bereaved Should Know, but Are Too Polite to Ask." He accepted both with thanks and turned to leave. "Inspector," came a voice behind him. It was Mrs. Dennop, now coatless and bold. "You ought to look at what she left on her desk." "We have," said Purbright. "Not the official pile. The one under the blotter. There was a name there." "Yes?" "Someone not dead." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "How do you know?" "Because he delivered my groceries yesterday." The name she gave was not unfamiliar. It had appeared briefly in the paper 6 years prior in a paragraph under accidental drownings. The man had been assumed to have slipped on a mooring. "I saw him," Mrs. Dennop said again. "He's got the same eyebrows and the same limp." She did not ask whether this meant something was wrong. She did not ask what would be done. In Flaxborough, one did not ask. Purbright made a note, not in his case file, but in the slim blue book he kept for matters requiring quiet inquiry. That the dead might walk was not, in itself, alarming, but that the obituary was ready for them in advance, typed, corrected, and waiting, that was rather more so. In matters concerning the dead, Mr. Glass had always conducted himself with a kind of oblique cheer. He wore dark suits with the consistency of a man who had forgotten other colors existed and spoke in a soft, exhaling tone that made every condolence sound like a weather report. As senior partner of Glass and Trimble established 1874, Flaxborough's most enduring mortuary concern, he presided over the departed with dignity, punctuality, and an instinctive avoidance of anything resembling emotion. Inspector Purbright had arranged to meet him under the neutral pretext of a discussion regarding recent procedural irregularities. In Flaxborough, this phrase usually meant someone had been seen smoking in a non-designated zone, or that a parish newsletter had misattributed a hymn. They met in the undertaker's front parlor, a space sparsely furnished with green leather chairs, 2 unlit gas lamps, and a calendar displaying a pastoral view of somewhere emphatically not in Lincolnshire. Mr. Glass, already seated, rose with funereal grace. "Inspector," he said, offering a hand that felt more ceremonial than tactile. "I trust you're not here in an official capacity." "Only in the loosest sense," Purbright replied. "No sirens." "Good," Mr. Glass nodded. "They unsettle the elderly, and the young are rarely listening." They settled themselves, Purbright declining the offer of a barley mint from a dish shaped like an urn. "I gather," said Purbright, "that your firm handled the arrangements for Miss Eileen Cleeve." "Ah, yes, efficient woman, though difficult to pin down on certain matters. Details of interment, for example. She was always rather vague." "Had she, to your knowledge, made prior arrangements?" Mr. Glass steepled his fingers. "A loose plan. She had requested cremation, specified no mourners, and left a note regarding her own obituary, unusual but not unprecedented." "Did she mention family?" "Number merely a list of instructions typed on cream paper, single-spaced and punctuated with a precision bordering on the obsessive. We are accustomed, Inspector, to eccentricities among the living, but hers bore a certain, how shall I say, editorial confidence." Purbright inclined his head. "Did she ever speak of other deaths? Clients, perhaps?" "Well," said Mr. Glass, with the quiet air of a man stepping to the edge of something distasteful, "there were individuals who prearranged their own departures. That's not unusual either. But in some cases, just a few, Miss Cleeve had made contact on their behalf, offered summaries, requested on occasion that the more delicate information be omitted. And payment? Always in cash, modest sums, nothing that would alarm a bank manager." Mr. Glass leaned forward. She operated, if I may say so, with a curious kind of authority, not coercive exactly, but persuasive. She had a way of suggesting that silence would be a kindness. "And was it?" "In some cases," said Mr. Glass dryly, "a very considerable one." Purbright produced the slim black ledger recovered from Miss Cleeve's desk. "Do any of these names look familiar?" Mr. Glass glanced briefly, then nodded. "Yes. At least 3 of those gentlemen were buried, or rather not publicly buried, through our discretion packages." "Discretion packages?" "A service for those who wish to avoid fuss or questions, often a closed casket, an early morning slot, occasionally a cremation with no record in the local paper." "And what's required for that?" "A death certificate. The rest can be managed." Purbright turned the page. "Have you ever had occasion to lose a certificate?" Mr. Glass smiled gently. "One never loses them, Inspector. One simply finds them more slowly than usual." Meanwhile, Sergeant Love had spent the morning at the Municipal Archive, a cheerless corridor of filing drawers and disapproving notices. It was here, in the company of Miss Teatley, archivist, notary, and collector of Victorian stationery, that he unearthed something of interest. "She came in," said Miss Teatley, not looking up from a box of tax records, On the last Friday of every month, like a ritual. To do what? To correct. Miss Teatley sniffed. She'd bring in names, mostly minor. She'd say there had been a change in phrasing or that something had been agreed upon with the family. Sometimes she brought her own carbon copies. Did you question her? I never had cause to. She was always very proper. Love flipped through a folder. Was she ever wrong? Never. That's what made her so unusual. Even the liars get their verbs mixed up eventually. She didn't. It was in the back room, amid a stack of property disposal forms, that Love found a folder marked simply C. Inside were several redacted death notices, all edited in Miss Cleave's hand. They bore curious omissions: wives turned into sisters, ages adjusted downward, professions mysteriously upgraded from municipal janitor to custodian of civic hygiene. One death certificate, dated 3 years earlier, had been struck through, the margins bearing a penciled note, duplicate not to be filed. Subject relocated. Love blinked at the phrase. Relocated? He asked. Miss Teatley, now dusting a metal drawer with a handkerchief, did not look up. Miss Cleave's term, not mine. I always assumed it meant cremation or reinvention. Later that day, Love rejoined Purbright in the latter's office, where the two men compared notes over weak tea and the distant sound of someone shouting about rates at the town hall entrance. She rewrote them, Love said. Not just their deaths, their lives. Purbright nodded, and more than that, she curated their exits. What for? Perhaps kindness, perhaps leverage. Love hesitated, then produced a document he had found folded inside one of the folders. A solicitor named Puddlewick sent this, said he was instructed to forward it in the event of Miss Cleave's death. Purbright unfolded the letter. To whom it may concern, if you are reading this, then I am no longer arranging endings. I did not blackmail them. I simply offered options. Some wanted silence, some wanted forgiveness. A few simply wanted to disappear. The world is more hospitable to the dead than the disgraced. I provided them with the former, occasionally in advance. E. Cleave. There was no further commentary, only a list, names, dates, and, next to each, what appeared to be a code name. Some matched initials, others were obscure, but one stood out. A signature, just R.W., and beneath it, in quotation marks, Swanley House. Purbright set the list aside, but not out of reach. The card quoting Catullus, the cremations without funerals, the pre-written obituaries of men still walking. These were not crimes, perhaps, but they were arrangements, and Miss Cleave, it seemed, had arranged more than most. Mrs. Enid Tiplady, widow, occasional invigilator, and custodian of the lesser-known doctrines of the Women's Temperance Guild, had never approved of Eileen Cleave's use of adjectives. No man, she once said, ought to be remembered as enigmatic if all he did was fix clocks and avoid eye contact. Her tone was not unkind, merely resolute. She had known Miss Cleave from a distance. Polite nods at committee teas, the occasional exchange of minutes, and, like many in Flaxborough, she had regarded her not with suspicion, but with the mild disapproval reserved for those who dressed plainly, yet walked with purpose. It came as something of a surprise, then, when a stranger called upon Mrs. Tiplady one Thursday morning and asked, with quiet civility, if she might discuss the late Miss Cleave over a pot of lapsang. The caller was a woman in her late 50s, neatly dressed, with a complexion that suggested neither hardship nor indulgence. She gave her name as Mrs. Ruth Varley, and her smile as something very nearly sincere. Mrs. Tiplady, who had a lifelong policy of not declining visitors, when the parlor curtains were open, invited her in. They sat with tea and biscuits that had softened slightly in the tin. She spoke of you, said Mrs. Varley, examining the cup before lifting it. Fondly. "That's kind of her," said Mrs. Tiplady, who did not believe it. She was a conscientious woman. Her handwriting alone could have been displayed in schools. "Did she ever speak to you about her previous life?" Mrs. Tiplady paused. "She was, I believe, born in Harrogate." "Before she came here." The old woman gave a blink that might have been mistaken for a shrug. "Flaxborough does not inquire much into the past. That is one of its graces." Mrs. Varley sipped delicately. "She kept records." "That sounds likely. Did she ever hint at why?" "She liked order. Perhaps she found life too casual." Mrs. Varley looked up, her expression tilting only slightly. "You were both members of the guild." "We were," said Mrs. Tiplady, not defensively, but as though confirming a matter of historic fact. "Did she ever mention Swanley House?" The name sat in the air, oddly plush. Mrs. Tiplady's brow lifted, not in recognition but in appraisal. "I think not. It sounds rather like a retirement home for artists." Mrs. Varley reached into her handbag and withdrew a newspaper clipping. Faded, typewriter printed, and clearly from the Citizen. It was an obituary, unsigned, for one Lionel Braith, former local magistrate, deceased in 1979 of unspecified illness. "She wrote this," said Mrs. Varley. "I was told she left the original version on file." Mrs. Tiplady took the clipping and read it slowly. "A man of unflinching principle and discreet associations," she read aloud. "That sounds like Eileen. She was always fond of oxymoron." "What do you suppose she meant by discreet associations?" Mrs. Tiplady, who had no trouble parsing euphemism, allowed herself the smallest of smiles. "It depends on which side of the river you're buried." Mrs. Varley leaned forward. "I believe she was protecting people." "Protecting them from what?" "From themselves, in some cases, from discovery in others." There was a pause while the clock on the mantel chimed the hour, with a tone of gently embarrassed obligation. "She told me once," said Mrs. Varley quietly, "that no one in Flaxborough really dies. They just get rephrased." Outside, the postman passed the garden gate with a nod that did not require a response. Inside, Mrs. Tiplady considered her guest. "You were close to her." "I was indebted," said Mrs. Varley. "She edited me, not in print, but in life. It was not unpleasant, but it meant something." She placed the clipping on the table and rose. "I just wanted to know if anyone else understood." Mrs. Tiplady stood as well, her knees registering the movement with audible restraint. "She made herself understood," she said. "That's the difference between being liked and being obeyed." Mrs. Varley left with a quiet thank you and walked with mild haste towards the town center. From an upstairs window across the street, Inspector Purbright, who had taken up a quiet station at the vicarage guest room with borrowed binoculars and a borrowed excuse, lowered the lenses. He joined Sergeant Love, who was waiting downstairs in the vicar's study, pretending to catalog hymnals. "She didn't stay long," Love remarked. But she brought something with her," said Purbright, "or rather, took something away." He looked again at the carbon copy of Miss Cleeve's obituary for Lionel Braith. The original had included one sentence, absent from the published version. His arrangement with Swanley House, though never publicly acknowledged, brought a certain symmetry to his decline. "Varley," said Purbright aloud. "Where have I heard that name?" Love reached into the case file and withdrew a folded page from the Register of Charities. "Ruth Varley, treasurer of the Swanley Social Health Trust, defunct since 1983. And the address?" Love pointed. "Same postbox number as the old massage service Swanley House used." Purbright looked out the window again. The afternoon light made Flaxborough appear more innocent than usual. "So Miss Cleeve edited the dead," he said, almost to himself. "But some of them hadn't stopped breathing yet." In a folder marked Obits Private in Miss Cleeve's filing cabinet, a single envelope remained sealed. On it, in neat purple ink, was written, "To be published in the event of Mr. Hoadley's sudden disappearance." Mr. Hoadley, unfortunately, or perhaps not, was currently very much alive. Mr. Leonard Hoadley was the kind of man about whom entire lives could be imagined, yet rarely were. His face, though perfectly symmetrical, remained oddly unmemorable. His habits, though precise, were almost invisible. For 20 years he had served as deputy clerk to the borough council, and in all that time had raised his voice only once, when someone attempted to alter the punctuation in the council's standing orders. No one in Flaxborough disliked Mr. Hoadley. They simply forgot with remarkable ease that he was there. On the Wednesday following Miss Cleeve's funeral, a modest affair, damp but well punctuated, Mr. Hoadley emerged from his terraced bungalow on Beach Close, wearing his walking coat and the expression of a man on a very small mission. He walked the long way into town, avoiding Market Square and instead taking the quieter route along Library Street, past the hedge that was never trimmed quite evenly and the bakery that had ceased baking but retained its scent. Purbright, who had developed a professional fondness for Library Street, ever since noticing how frequently the guilty avoided it, was already loitering beneath a municipal elm with a bag of books he had no intention of returning. Sergeant Love was across the road pretending to inspect a bench. Hoadley paused by the town library not out of sentiment but from habit. The building had once been a gentleman's club and still retained a faint smell of cigars and feigned laughter. He stood for a moment, then continued on, glancing neither left nor right, save to nod at the ornamental railings as though they might have asked something. It was, to the trained observer, the walk of a man who believed he might be watched, but could not prove it. Later that day, Purbright convened a quiet conference in the back room of the police station, where the chairs were firm and the tea came with warnings. "The sealed envelope," he said, laying it before Love and Miss Teatime, who had somehow made herself indispensable to the inquiry, despite never being asked. "To be published," Miss Teatime read, adjusting her glasses, "in the event of Mr. Hoadley's sudden disappearance." "She certainly didn't lack foresight," Love murmured. "Indeed," said Purbright, "although I am not certain whether she expected foul play or simple bureaucracy." They opened the envelope. Inside was a typed obituary. It was uncharacteristically long. "Mr. Leonard Hoadley, former deputy clerk to the Flaxborough Borough Council, will be remembered for his quiet rectitude, his unwavering devotion to the rules of procedural order, and his long-standing financial arrangements with a series of enterprises whose status, though technically charitable, occasionally conflicted with their clientele's understanding of the term community health." Miss Teatime raised a brow, pointed. "There's more," Purbright said, and turned the page. Of particular note was Mr. Hoadley's role as co-signatory on the dormant Swanley Social Health Trust, which, during its final year, issued reimbursements under the euphemism of wellness stipends to a series of unnamed beneficiaries. Miss Cleeve, upon reviewing the trust's accounts in her capacity as volunteer typist, made annotations in the margins. These annotations, if preserved, will explain more than this obituary ever could. They all sat back in silence for a moment. The typeface, they noted, was slightly different from her usual, a portable Royal rather than the office Remington. Miss Cleeve, it seemed, had composed this from home. Sergeant Love looked troubled. "Would this be libelous?" Purbright folded the paper carefully. "Fortunately, libel laws do not apply to the dead. It's the living who suffer embarrassment." Miss Teatime, who had been tapping the table with a very expensive fingernail, said quietly, "It rather sounds like she was using the obituaries as—" "What?" "Insurance?" A sort of deferred disclosure, Purbright agreed, to be released only if the balance of the narrative shifted too far in someone else's favor. Love glanced again at the document. And who would she expect to publish it? She sent copies to herself, said Purbright, by post, marked for future insertion. I believe Mr. Pym at the Citizen kept a drawer for such things, although I suspect he thought they were recipes. And the annotations? Asked Miss Teatime. In the trust accounts? That's next, said Purbright, but we must tread carefully. Accusing a civil servant of corruption in Flaxborough is like accusing the rain of being wet. It causes no scandal, only dampness. Across town, Mr. Hoadley was returning home by a different route, one that passed the old tram depot and skirted the allotments. His pace was measured, but his eyes, normally so content to stare at curbstones, now shifted nervously from gate to hedge. He had seen the notice board outside the Citizen offices earlier that morning, and while no names were mentioned, he had a particular sensitivity to turns of phrase. Flaxborough mourns a woman of insight, discretion, and unshakable memory. He had also noticed the small man standing near the tobacconist's, seemingly interested in pipes he had no intention of buying, and the woman in the hat outside the charity shop, possibly waiting for a lift, or possibly not. In his living room that evening, Mr. Hoadley made a phone call. It was brief and contained only one sentence. "We may need to revise the file." The voice at the other end said something indistinct, and then, click. In the town hall basement, where old audit reports slumbered among the dust of forgotten grants, a box was quietly removed that night. It was labeled Swanley Dissolution and Misc, and had not been touched since 1984. By morning it was missing. The drawing room of Mrs. Nesta Rigby was one of those spaces where time, if not taste, had been preserved. The carpet was tufted, the wallpaper floral, and the air scented faintly of those lavender sachets purchased in aid of funds whose causes had long since expired. The only truly modern addition was a portable television, though this, having proved distressingly liberal in its news coverage, had been draped with lace and demoted to a corner. It was into this setting that Inspector Purbright now stepped, removing his hat with the solemnity of one who suspected he was about to be offered a biscuit he could not refuse. Mrs. Rigby, once the wife of Alderman Cecil Rigby, and more recently the president of the Flaxborough Ladies' Benevolent Association, defunct, received him with that brand of gracious suspicion known only to women of her generation who had both secrets and embroidered handkerchiefs. "I won't pretend to be surprised," she said, pouring a very thin tea. "Eileen always had tendencies." "What sort of tendencies?" asked Purbright, accepting the cup with an inward wince. "Quiet ones, which are the worst kind." The inspector settled onto a settee that resisted accommodation. "I understand you knew her through the Temperance Guild." "Oh, yes. She was marvelously thorough with the minutes, and never once alluded to the gin breath of certain members, which frankly showed tact if not conviction." Purbright allowed himself a slow nod. "Did she ever discuss her other commitments?" "Obituaries, you mean?" "Among others." Mrs. Rigby adjusted a brooch which bore, rather pointedly, a miniature enamel lamb. "There were rumors," she said delicately, "about her volunteer work, unverified naturally, but one always knows when a woman types too well." "I see." "You don't," said Mrs. Rigby with faint satisfaction, "but you may yet." There followed a pause in which the ticking of a decorative clock took on an accusatory rhythm. Eventually, Purbright produced the object that had warranted the visit, a thin ledger bound in green cloth labeled Swanley Trust, Correspondence and Notes. It had not been in the box marked Swanley, Dissolution and Misc. That box, as of that morning, remained quite gone, but rather in a drawer of the Citizens' Archives, misfiled behind clippings about the 1982 Junior Council bake sale. "I wonder," he said, "if this handwriting seems familiar to you." Mrs. Rigby took her time adjusting her spectacles, then, with a satisfied hum, pointed to a marginal note in faded blue ink. "R.W. not to be reimbursed until H confirms non-disclosure." "Eileen," she said, and no mistake. "R.W. "Robert Wanslow," she said with a briskness that suggested he ought to have known. "Reverend Wanslow's unfortunate nephew, awful hair, took up something in physiotherapy before the business in Ely." "And H? That would be Hoadley," she added, as though this were obvious. Leonard had a knack for remaining upright in slippery terrain. Purbright's eyebrows rose half a degree. "So Miss Cleeve knew." "Oh, Inspector," Mrs. Rigby sighed, "Miss Cleeve knew everything. She simply chose when it might be useful." Back at the station, Sergeant Love was attempting to track down the current address of Mr. Robert Wanslow, who, according to recent records, had last been employed at a private wellness clinic in Suffolk, one which had shut down shortly after the unfortunate discovery that its therapeutic oils contained something faintly hypnotic. "No forwarding address," Love said glumly, "but a credit card trail shows a purchase at a Flaxborough petrol station 3 weeks ago." "Was he alone?" asked Purbright. "Number 2 cups of tea and a packet of marshmallow tea cakes." Purbright considered this, then tapped the ledger with the back of his pencil. "It's beginning to resemble a circle, but not yet a noose." That evening, the vicar of St. Timothy's, an anxious young man whose sermons had recently begun to flirt with the idea of metaphor, found something unsettling in the vestry mailbox, a packet wrapped in brown paper and twine. Inside was a typed manuscript with a note in Miss Cleeve's precise hand. "For safekeeping. Should I prove inconvenient." The manuscript contained not 1, but 7 obituaries, each for a living person, and each of them already titled. The Reverend Timothy Skegg of St. Timothy's Church was a man of tender convictions and administrative terror. He had taken holy orders with the hazy intention of guiding souls, only to discover within a year that most souls in Flaxborough required not guidance but gentle discouragement from committee involvement. He was also, at that particular hour of morning, attempting to draft a sermon on forgiveness while staring at an envelope that refused to be forgiven. It sat before him on the vestry table, wrapped in the kind of brown paper used for cheap hymnals and slow poisonings. The note clipped to it, written in the late Miss Cleeve's almost ecclesiastical script, bore the kind of warning one never really wants. From the dead, to be opened in the event of discomfort. The vicar had been feeling discomfort since breakfast. He debated telephoning the bishop, but remembered how the bishop had once responded to a request for clarification on moral ambiguity with the phrase, "Use discretion and remember the budget." Thus emboldened, or rather abandoned, he opened the package. Inside, 7 obituaries, each with full name, date of birth, and a précis of life rendered in Miss Cleeve's familiar prose. All 7 subjects were, to his certain knowledge, still alive. One had led morning prayers only last week. Another sold pears at the Saturday market and was known to haggle. And one, Leonard Hoadley, had recently submitted a new standing order for the church flower rota. Reverend Skegg stared at the pages. They were not drafts. They were final. They were typeset, punctuated, titled, and annotated with insertion instructions for the Flaxborough Citizen. He did what any terrified clergyman with a fear of headlines might. He phoned the police. Inspector Purbright arrived in less than an hour, bringing with him a face of complete calm, and Sergeant Love carrying a folder labeled Cleeve, remaining questions. "I didn't read them all," Skegg said, handing over the papers like contraband, just enough to require theological reflection. Purbright reviewed the names in silence. Mr. Braxted, the retired accountant. Mrs. Netherby, once secretary of the allotment oversight panel. Mr. Hoadley, Ruth Varley, the Reverend Hempsall, one of the Wanslow nephews, and Mr. Finchley, the rarely cited former editor of the Diocesan Recorder. Love peered over Purbright's shoulder. "That's a peculiar list." "It is," Purbright agreed, "but not random. Each of them, in one form or another, passed through the financial entrails of the Swanley Social Health Trust." Skegg cleared his throat. "Might I ask, if it's not a breach of procedure, why would Miss Cleeve have written obituaries for the living?" "There are several reasons," said Purbright, "but in this case I suspect it was a precaution." "Against what?" "Being tidied away." The vicar, who had just placed his spectacles beside the sugar bowl, now picked them up again. "You mean murdered?" "Not necessarily. Some people are made to disappear with little more than a sigh and a few confused letters to the editor." At that moment, Sergeant Love received a call from the records office. "Another Cleeve envelope," he said after hanging up. "Posted to the parish archivist. Same label. It contains a typed document entitled, 'For clarification upon my disappearance or death, whichever comes first.'" Purbright glanced again at the list of names. "And what clarification does she offer?" Love read aloud from his notes. "I did not blackmail. I simply proposed a form of assisted narrative. Some paid, some did not. Some disappeared by choice. A few asked for help. I offered endings because they feared their truths would live too long." The Reverend, whose grasp on forgiveness was largely theological, muttered something about moral ambiguity and excused himself to make tea. Left alone, the two policemen reviewed the 7 obituaries again. Each, it seemed, included a sentence that delicately suggested its subject's involvement in some charitable misdirection. Mr. Finchley's read, "In his later years, Mr. Finchley retired from public discourse, but continued to advise various discreet funds, occasionally under pseudonym and Ruth Varley's. Mrs. Varley's commitment to community healing, though misunderstood, remained unfaltering. She will be remembered for her treasurership, her silence, and her timely withdrawals." The most curious of all was that of Reverend Hempsall. Though his pulpit grew quieter in later years, his signature remained in wide circulation. Purbright tapped the margin. "She didn't write these for publication," he said. "Not immediately. They were deterrents, held in reserve. If anything happened to her, they would ensure that something happened to everyone else," said Love. That evening at the small retirement flats off Chapel Lane, Mr. Finchley, who had not read the paper in 3 years, received an unsigned envelope through his letterbox. It contained a carbon copy of his obituary, with a single line underlined. He folded it once, then calmly placed it into the fire beneath his kettle. The next morning, Mrs. Snapstone, chair of the Women's Temperance Guild, reported that the church notice board had been tampered with. Someone had replaced the monthly quote with a sheet of cream paper bearing just 3 words, "Final edits pending." Mr. Leonard Hoadley had once been described in a Chamber of Commerce newsletter as a man of quiet means and even quieter ambitions. The phrase had clung to him ever since, like a faint and persistent odor of mothballs. He lived in a mock Tudor bungalow behind the Methodist chapel and maintained a commendable interest in local history, if not always its legality. On Tuesday mornings, he delivered hand-picked apples to the rectory. On Thursday evenings, he played canasta with the more docile members of the Rotary Club. He was, to all appearances, untroublingly content. It was therefore with some consternation that he opened his post one afternoon to find an obituary written entirely in the past tense and concerning himself. The document had the creased texture of long-kept secrets and bore the unmistakable signature of Miss Eileen Cleeve, typed in perfect line with the margins just beneath the words, "Died peacefully, though under circumstances yet unclarified." Hoadley made no fuss. He placed the page under a paperweight shaped like the Queen Mother and proceeded to butter 2 slices of toast. It was not until tea time that he walked, calmly and deliberately, to the office of Purbright. The inspector, in the middle of penning a memorandum of exquisite ambiguity to the borough clerk, looked up with interest. "Mr. Hoadley, how civic of you." "I presume," said Hoadley, after removing his gloves with theatrical precision, "that I am not the first to have received one." Purbright motioned to the teacups. "Milk and sugar, number. But thank you for assuming a degree of sweetness." They settled into the sort of silence that Flaxborough men used in place of confession. Hoadley laid the obituary on the table with a reverence usually reserved for disputed invoices. "I wish to say that I had no involvement in the woman's death," he said, "nor have I accused you. Nor has anyone else, which I find even more unnerving." Purbright read the obituary again. Miss Cleeve did not write in haste or mercy. I rather think she believed this was a form of it. They spoke for several minutes about the ethics of preemptive remembrance. Hoadley admitted, with the resignation of one long overdue for discovery, that he had once contributed a modest monthly stipend to the Swanley Trust. The amount, he emphasized, was no greater than he might have paid for gym membership or the Orchestral Society's wine subscription. "I believed the money went toward rehabilitation, massage therapies, rent for the facility." Purbright gave him a long, contemplative look. "The facility, Mr. Hoadley, was a rented garage behind a pet shop." "Ah, yes." Hoadley stood, smoothed his coat, and placed a small folder on the inspector's desk. "In the interest of cooperation, and, if I'm honest, posterity, I have compiled a list of names, former donors. Some were perhaps more closely connected than I." Purbright opened the folder without comment. The first name was familiar, the second more so. The fifth was Reverend Hempsall. At that moment Sergeant Love entered, holding a newspaper clipping with one gloved hand and a damp umbrella in the other. "Inspector, the Rudge Mercury has published an unsigned letter in its community notes section. It reads, 'Some people write memoirs. Others are written into them.'" Purbright looked up from the list. "And the editor?" "Claims it was delivered by hand. No return address." The inspector leaned back. "It appears," he said, "that Miss Cleeve's reputation is not the only one in posthumous jeopardy." As Hoadley let himself out, Purbright studied the last few names on the list. They were tidy citizens with unblemished records, generous opinions, and a tendency to sit on multiple committees at once. That evening, a municipal typist found a bundle of carbon sheets abandoned behind a radiator in the citizen's back office, each bearing the beginning of a sentence, but none the end. One of them read, "The following persons wish to remain unknown, but their histories do not." There was a lightness in the air that morning, unnatural to Flaxborough and received with general suspicion. The bakery sold out of bath buns before 11, and Mrs. Soppet of the Urban District Council felt uncharacteristically inclined to forgive a clerical error made by her second cousin in the rates office. Such things did not go unnoticed by Inspector Purbright. At the police station, a modest gathering of boxes sat under Sergeant Love's desk. They contained carbon duplicates, intercepted letters, and, in one case, a lavender-scented envelope addressed in a sloping, unconfident hand to Mr. R.W. The evidence of Miss Cleeve's other occupation, or ministry, depending on one's moral framework, was now complete. Purbright, in no hurry to prosecute reputations, had spent the week drafting a private memorandum for the chief constable. It was long, elaborate, and studiously inconclusive. In light of the deceased's singular position, he had written, "It is my view that no public good would be served by a formal inquest, nor any legal clarity achieved by the exposure of those formerly anonymized in her files." Sergeant Love, who still believed that police work ought to lead somewhere measurable, asked with mild despair, "And what, sir, do we tell the editor of the Citizen?" Purbright folded the letter from Miss Cleeve, discovered tucked inside the hollow base of her barley sweet tin. It was not addressed, but the salutation was unmistakable, to be read, if necessary, by someone with a sense of proportion. "She has, I think, left us her own editorial," Purbright replied. The letter, written in firm strokes and unhurried syntax, explained little. Miss Cleeve spoke of service, of private obligations rendered without hope of recompense, and of the necessary barter between the body and the conscience. Nowhere did she admit guilt, nor did she offer any explanation for the obituaries she had prepared in advance, some of which, notably, had never been printed, but kept in reserve like final chess pieces. The Swanley House file was sealed and placed among the archives under the mutually understood label of correspondence, miscellaneous. A few of the names had been quietly advised to increase their charitable donations to St. Timothy's Roof Fund, or to offer lectures on civic duty at the local grammar school. The Reverend Hempsall, whose name had appeared third on Hoadley's list, resigned suddenly for health reasons and was seen soon after taking early retirement in the Lake District. Mr. Pym, the editor of the Citizen, announced that the obituary column would henceforth be written by a committee. "There is less risk of tone," he said with evident relief. As for Miss Cleeve, she was buried with gentle solemnity in the parish cemetery. The eulogy was read by a woman from the Temperance Guild who had once spoken harshly of her hat choices, but now wept quietly into a lace handkerchief. The headstone bore only her name and the words, "She made herself useful." On the following Sunday, Purbright strolled past the cemetery on his way to a painfully polite luncheon with Councillor Chubb. He paused briefly at Miss Cleeve's grave, observed the neatness of its edges, and said nothing. A bee, unseasonably hopeful, hovered over the barley sweets someone had left in a tin beside the stone, and so Flaxborough returned to its customary decency, tidily disordered, gently corrupt, and more or less at peace with itself.